Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at King's Quest, an adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online and released for the IBM PC Junior computer platform in 1984, with numerous ports to other computer ecosystems following in later years. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 107. I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is King's Quest. King's Quest is an adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online and released for the IBM PC Junior computer platform in 1984, with a bunch of ports and even remakes and remasters following in later years for multiple computer systems. Before we can talk about King's Quest, we need to take a step back and consider the state of adventure gaming around the time that King's Quest was created, and also some of the history around its creator and visionary Roberta Williams, a key figure in computer and video game history who we've touched upon before, but haven't really dived into with any significant detail. Adventure game aficionados and gaming historians will likely recognize that no discussion about Roberta Williams can be complete without looking at the history of Sierra Online, the company she co-founded with her husband Ken Williams, which would become one of the heavy hitters in the adventure game genre throughout the 80s and 90s. Sierra Online, along with LucasArts, really put the adventure game genre on the map in its early days, and in the process, created a healthy competitive rivalry that would continue throughout both companies' respective lifetimes, with each company focusing on different styles of games, engines, and storyline themes. We've already talked a lot about LucasArts across various episodes of this podcast, but Sierra? We've only really discussed them in passing. The time to right that wrong is now. So let's start talking about Sierra Online. The first question you might ask when thinking about Sierra Online could potentially be, what was Sierra Online, the company, like back in the early 80s? And the simple answer to that question is not Sierra Online. In fact, if we take a look a little further back, in the 1970s, both Ken and Roberta Williams, who many know are the founders of Sierra Online, weren't even the least bit interested in computer games, or by extension, adventure games. Ken Williams was in the computing industry, but his focus was squarely on business software, because, as we've talked about numerous times before, computers around this time were thought of as productivity machines, not gaming platforms. Roberta Williams, by contrast, was a stay-at-home mom who, unlike Ken, had no interest in computers at the time at all. All of that would change, however, when Ken purchased his first Apple II computer in 1980. Interestingly, the reason for purchasing the Apple II was, at least as it relates to video and computer games, not all that exciting. As part of his business software focus, Ken had wanted to create a port of the fairly popular Fortran programming language over to the Apple II, which he thought would be able to challenge BASIC as the standard programming tool for Apple computers. BASIC, an anagram for Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, was a simple, higher-level programming language that was used pretty widely across the majority of the Apple computer ecosystem of the time, without much competition from other programming languages of the time. Ken Williams wanted to change all of that by bringing Fortran to Apple computers, and to understand why that proposed project was a big deal, we need to talk just a little bit about how computer programming languages were distributed in the early days of the personal computer market. For those who may be unaware, around this time, computer programming languages were not nearly as pervasive as what we see in today's market, and beyond that, the simple act of running software on different computer platforms required extensive work. Think about today, where you might have a software development environment like Unity that talented developers can use to generate executable code that can be packaged to run on any number of target systems like home consoles, computers, and even portable devices like tablets and phones. Modern tools make that kind of thing easy, and oftentimes the creators of those tools offer versions of the toolset that run on any number of common computer platforms like Linux, Windows, and Mac OS. Back in the late 70s, though, the concept of multiple versions of anything being provided by a single software creator was a rarity, and oftentimes making software work on platforms that weren't targeted by those companies required someone else to actually port the software or tool to those different platforms, which was a surprisingly lucrative business to be in, assuming your ports were higher quality than most amateur efforts of the time. Ken Williams had always considered himself to be a talented software developer, and he believed he had the skill needed to complete his Fortran port and hopefully make some money doing it. So he decided to make things official, creating a company of his own to perform the future work under. That company would be called Online Systems. Despite Ken's focus on business software, during one of his work assignments, he acquired access to a brand new game that had been making the rounds across numerous computer mainframes, universities, and even personal computers of the time. The literal grandfather of all adventure games, Will Crowther's classic Adventure, or Colossal Cave Adventure depending on which version of the game you're talking about. Ken had no interest in the game, but he figured it might be something of interest to show his wife, and might help her pass some time while she stayed at home as Ken worked on his various projects. So, he introduced the game to Roberta, and she immediately became enthralled, shirking all responsibilities to play the game through to completion, even staying up overnight to try to conquer the game's various puzzles and traps. Eventually, she did beat the game, and with her newfound love of what was then considered the adventure game genre, she began to seek out other similar titles to enjoy. She tried several, enjoying the expansive for the time worlds that the games presented, along with their tricky and devious puzzles that required significant thought and logical leaps to solve. After playing a bunch of these titles and drawing on prior time spent reading Agatha Christie novels and playing the classic board game Clue, Roberta became inspired. What if she could design and create her own adventure game, potentially to sell on the still nascent computer game market? The concept intrigued her, and she began discussing the idea with her husband. While he was very supportive of Roberta's ideas, Ken didn't want to create something that was derivative or similar to any of the titles that were already out there. Instead, he wanted to push the technological boundaries of what people thought were possible, and wanted to create something that would be different from the status quo, which around this time was a predominantly text-driven and non-graphical user interface. Ever the visionary, Ken decided that Roberta's game proposal needed to exceed the expectations of the market, so he fired back a proposal of his own. He'd help Roberta create her game, but it would have to transcend a purely text interface. He wanted to create a title with full-featured graphics. To put things into perspective, at the time in computer gaming that we're talking about, the concept of graphics on a computer screen weren't really much of a thing, and the majority of computer systems available didn't even have any discrete mechanisms for generating graphics at all. Just look at the adventure games that had been released to date, whose interfaces were all purely text-driven, and at the time, there really wasn't even a passing thought that graphics could improve the experience of what had, up to that point, been more akin to interactive novels as opposed to a more visual kind of experience. That was all about to change, though, as Roberta Williams set out to create her first game, Mystery House. The story behind the development of Mystery House is actually really interesting and shows a great deal of ingenuity, especially for what were, at the time, amateur game developers. As Ken and Roberta set off to create the game, they encountered two main difficulties. One, how would they get graphics into a computer? Because current mechanisms for drawing were cumbersome, and the mouse, if you can believe it, wasn't yet available as a general input device for personal computers. And secondly, how would they be able to store all of the graphics for their game inside the tiny amount of memory available to them at the time, which was literally measurable in kilobytes? Luckily for them, Ken Williams had some really strong technical prowess, and in both cases, he came up with solutions that were, from my perspective, insanely creative. In order to create graphics inside the computer, Ken purchased what was effectively a drawing tablet that could trace engineering diagrams into a computer, but as designed, it couldn't really handle the kinds of content that would typically be present in actual pictures. It was truly only designed for use by engineers, along with the limited types and styles of drawings that job would require. In other words, anything with standard straight lines could be traced fairly easily, but anything involving more complex diagrams or structures just wasn't supported by the software that accompanied the tablet. So Ken did what any talented programmer would do in a similar situation. He decided to create his own software to interface with the tablet and generate computer-based graphics that would be used for the game. At the same time, because storing actual images inside the computer would be literally impossible given the available storage, he decided to store the images as draw commands as opposed to actual graphics. Meaning, the computer would actually redraw the image using the exact commands used to originally scan the graphics in, every time someone played the game. All the computer needed to do was store coordinates in space representing the critical endpoints of lines and other geometric shapes, and Ken would provide instructions for how to connect those points together to create actual visual graphics. Using this technique, Roberta and Ken were able to fit over 30 discrete rooms and images onto a single 5¼ inch computer disk that held the game, which would have been an impossible feat otherwise. So, now that there was a mechanism to represent and store graphics in the computer, the next logical question was, what should the interface be like and how would it actually play? And the answer to those questions is actually a little varied. The game itself was designed to use graphics in conjunction with a text parser interface, where a number of story elements were displayed visually on screen, accompanied by text that would provide additional details on whatever scene a player was looking at. But the game went beyond that to include non-static images that didn't just illustrate scenes depicted by text, but also included graphical objects that would advance the story. As an example, in one room, you may find a note on the floor. In a traditional computer game of the time, you might type a command into the text parser to examine the note, which would then result in the computer typing a description back to you as part of the running log of text interactions between yourself and the game. Well, in Mystery House, examining that note actually displayed a graphical version of that note on the screen, complete with graphics-driven text, as opposed to simple typewritten text returned by the game's parser. This might not sound like a big deal, but actually integrating visual graphics-driven information into what had previously been a text-only experience was an incredibly novel concept. The other amazing for the time feature is that if you pick the note up, it disappears from the graphical display on the screen, and if you drop it in another room, it then appears in the screen's graphics for that room. So, not only did the game use graphics for illustrative purposes, but the graphical scene itself changed based on a player's actions. This is something that we take for granted nowadays, even when playing old-school adventure games from the later 80s through the 90s. But to consider that this game, in 1980, was having actual quote-unquote interactive graphical scenes, while every other adventure game of the time was still using text-only interfaces, was, to put it mildly, amazing. Of course, in this instance, interactive simply means that a player's action causes the graphics to change. It's not really representative of direct interaction with the graphics like you might see in a true point-and-click adventure game because, as I mentioned earlier, the mouse wasn't even available to the general public at the time. Still, the wheels were set in motion to create a true graphical form of adventure gaming, and Mystery House was the catalyst that would lead to future efforts, including Roberta Williams' next game, The Wizard and the Princess. Before beginning work on the new game, the Williams duo decided that they were going to take the concept of Mystery House's graphics and expand upon them. To put that into perspective, by default, the Apple II, which is the system that they were primarily designing for, could display 6 colors as part of its high-resolution mode. And yes, I said high resolution. Obviously, looking back at that number now, it's laughable that 6 colors was even considered a high-resolution kind of image, but that was simply the state of computer graphics in the early 80s, and it was a core constraint that everyone had to work within. Mystery House was designed with that constraint in mind, and as a result, it looked fairly simple, with various colors displaying on screen only as a result of some pretty darn esoteric Apple II graphics rules that Steve Wozniak had programmed into the computer, that basically made different types of lines display using different colors. And when I say esoteric graphic rules, I really mean it. As an example, depending on the number of pixels wide a vertical line was, the color of that line would change, which feels really arbitrary to me. And I'm not saying those rules make a ton of sense, but for a dedicated programmer, exploiting the rules behind drawing Apple II graphics could potentially lead to some fairly impressive results. You just needed to know all of those rules and have a creative vision for how to use them. The thing is though, at the time, nobody was really exploring the graphical capabilities of the system. Except for, of course, Ken Williams. As always, Ken wanted to create a wow factor with any game he or his company, Online Systems, would create. To do that, though, within the confines of 6 colors, would prove to be difficult for anyone. So, in another act of ingenuity and creativity, Ken went about creating new color-based graphics drawing programs on the Apple II that could effectively increase the perceived colors on the computer from 6 to 21. This process, which was accomplished using a technique called dithering, involved placing specific differently colored pixels near each other, which would then be blended together as a result of the unique circuitry inside of every Apple II computer, creating the human perception that more colors were being painted on the screen than what were actually being used inside the computer program. The software Ken created for this process was so advanced, in fact, that Online Systems ended up selling those graphics programs as standalone software packages for others to buy and use. And if you ever have a chance, I highly recommend you take a look at the pictures that these graphics programs were capable of, or perhaps simply compare the graphics from Mystery House with the graphics from The Wizard and the Princess. The difference in quality, from my perspective, is dramatic. Anyway, The Wizard and the Princess was designed very similarly to Mystery House, albeit with much more advanced graphics like we just talked about. It still had a text parser for inputs and a graphical display for depicting pseudo-interactive scenes, but the game was a fair bit more complex than the quaint stylings of Mystery House, with many more puzzles to solve and more scenes to explore. The story, unlike Mystery House's focus on an Agatha Christie-esque murder mystery style game, which you might have also guessed by the game's title, was focused more on a fantasy-like setting, which observant listeners will likely surmise would eventually lead to the fairy tale concepts that would be used to great effect in King's Quest. But we're not ready to make that leap just yet. First, we need to talk about another game created by Online Systems, and one that would be the first, or one of the first, games that utilized the concept of a team of individuals working on a project, as opposed to one or two people collaborating on a smaller effort. That game, which is pretty darn obscure, was called Time Zone, released in 1982, and was very similar in style to Roberta Williams' other games, which were all released under the High-Res Adventures label distributed by Online Systems. Wanting to continue expanding in scope, breadth, and technical wizardry beyond what Ken and Roberta Williams had accomplished before, Time Zone was supposed to be an absolutely massive game, consisting of 1,400 different scenes spread across multiple time periods, with time travel being a core mechanic integrated into the overall experience. In fact, the game was originally intended to be so expansive that each distinct timeline would effectively be as large as a traditional standalone adventure title, and Roberta Williams' goal was to create the feeling of a never-ending adventure, one that would be so expansive that the player could basically play forever, or at least for a very long time. As you might expect, given the immaturity of adventure game design around that time, this was a recipe for disaster. Drawing all of those images basically fell to one person who ultimately experienced burnout while working on the title, and the time travel mechanics and associated puzzles often didn't work the way they were intended to function, and those mechanics that did work were otherwise thought by players to be entirely unintuitive. Compounding the issue was the fact that because of the extreme effort it took to create the game, Online Systems thought they could charge an exorbitant amount of money for it. Now here, I'm going to pause for a second for you to guess how much you think they tried to sell the game for. Okay, you have your guess? Good. So, when Time Zone was released in 1982, the suggested price for the title was $99.95. That was an insane price for any game at the time, and would even be an insane price for games today, outside of special editions or games with bundled season passes. Let's think about that for a moment. A $100 game in 1982 is the equivalent of $326 today. The price was simply preposterous. I legitimately can't believe the cost of that game, especially when compared to the fact that AAA games today cost at most around $70. Suffice it to say, Time Zone did not sell well, and it was considered a failure by pretty much everyone that worked on or played the title. Fast forwarding a couple years, Time Zone's failure would become a distant memory for Online Systems, because after that title's release, business would pick up significantly for the company. They had released multiple high-res adventures, they had just changed the name of the company from Online Systems to Sierra Online, and under that new name, they had begun to develop an even better reputation for delivering high-quality adventure game experiences. In fact, their reputation had grown so much that they were able to strike a deal with IBM to create a brand new adventure game for their forthcoming PC Junior computer launch, a lower-cost IBM personal computer designed primarily as a gaming platform, and intended to compete with other game-friendly computer platforms of the time, namely the Apple II and Commodore 64. This deal between IBM and Sierra Online is what would eventually result in the creation of, you may have guessed it, King's Quest. Creating King's Quest would end up requiring a change to what was Sierra's traditional development process of the time, because, like we talked about, Ken Williams always wanted to push the limits of technology, and he felt that continuing to use the high-res model for the new game was going to be too similar to prior efforts. The goal was to once again create something groundbreaking, something that had never been done before. At this time, text adventures had grown dramatically in maturity, offering stories and puzzles that were much more complex than the Sierra-styled adventure games that the company had released to date. Sure, Sierra games had graphics, which was an innovative feature, but their titles hadn't evolved at the same speed as other adventure games, and as a result, Sierra was at risk of losing the computer industry foothold they had secured in prior years. During a meeting with IBM, Ken Williams laid out his plan to once again evolve the state of adventure gaming. Sierra's new game would have a graphical interface, similar to their prior games, but this one would take full advantage of the IBM PC Junior's unique graphical capabilities, that being a 16-color palette, which was dramatically better than the dithering techniques that had been used previously on Apple II displays. Further, rather than utilize a text parser interface for all commands and actions, the game would allow the player to control an avatar on the screen, with players being able to move their character around and interact with the environment directly, and see those actions play out in the graphical display on the screen. While a text parser would still be necessary for certain actions, like picking items up, players wouldn't have to use their imagination anymore to fill in the gaps of the rudimentary graphical scenes and text depictions of most games. They'd truly be living in a fully realized, highly detailed adventure game world. Williams' design called for puzzles to be able to be solved in multiple ways, leading to ingenious solutions that allowed for player choice, rather than having a single solution to every problem a player may encounter. And because of the sheer breadth of the game, it would require a team of individuals with various areas of expertise to create, all of whom Sierra would either hire or have on staff. In short, this was going to be the game that brought all of the concepts of Sierra's previous adventure games together, while at the same time advancing the state-of-the-art in adventure gaming to previously unexpected heights. That sales pitch sounded great to IBM, and they signed up on the spot, eventually providing almost all of the $850,000 budget needed to bring the game to life. Beyond the funding, and in order to make Ken Williams' pitch a reality, there was a lot that still had to happen. To start, there would need to be a brand new engine developed for handling the more complex interface and graphics requirements that was intended to be included with the game. We've spoken about engines multiple times throughout this podcast, but just to refresh everyone's memory, an engine is basically the framework that runs a game. Engines typically have common commands and procedures built into them for doing routine kinds of tasks, like displaying graphics, playing sounds, and accepting user inputs. And in the adventure game community, the most commonly known engine is likely the SCUM engine, which stands for the Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion. As we've talked about previously, that engine was created by LucasArts for, obviously, Maniac Mansion, and would go on to be used in the vast majority of LucasArts adventures throughout the 80s and 90s. Sierra, in the early 80s, had been using their own game engine for the high-res adventure games, one that had been created by Ken Williams to facilitate the creation of their games without requiring things to be reinvented from scratch each time. But for King's Quest, that engine would no longer be sufficient for handling the features of the title. Instead, the team turned to a man named Jeff Stevenson, who had been hired by Sierra to work on Time Zone, to develop a brand new engine specifically for King's Quest. That engine, which came to be known as the Adventure Game Interpreter, or AGI engine, ended up being the game engine that Sierra would use on all subsequent titles up through the late 80s, at which point they would develop a new engine, the Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI engine. Looking at the AGI engine, a number of key technical hurdles had to be overcome in order to deliver graphics and the experience that Ken Williams had promised to Sierra's new IBM partners. For one, the engine had to display graphics using a 16-color palette. The process for designing those graphics was, interestingly, very similar to the process used for Sierra's prior games, in that lines could be traced on a tablet and transcribed into the computer, not as actual images, but as drawing commands that the computer could execute as needed. Another aspect of the engine, and one that is directly related to its graphics capabilities, was the concept of scene depth. Because of the semi-side view perspective of the game's scenes, the engine had to be capable of dealing with players maneuvering their characters into or out of the scene, which meant that certain objects in a given scene would need to be able to be walked behind or in front of, maintaining the illusion of being in an actual fully realized world. Stevenson designed the engine to support multiple levels of depth, similar to layers in modern graphics programs, and the effect, especially in comparison to other games at the time, was simply mind-blowing. Equally mind-blowing for the time was the fact that the engine allowed for animations and other non-player characters on the screen, some of which could be spoken to, while others required you to avoid them or otherwise move through a scene without alerting them to your presence. These encounters were sometimes random in nature, leading to situations where not every player would have the same exact experience moving throughout the game, which, combined with puzzles that could be solved in multiple ways, lent itself to a degree of replayability previously not seen in adventure games. Of course, the role of designing those puzzles and the game itself fell to Ken's wife, Roberta Williams, and she took the fairy tale aspects of The Wizard and the Princess and effectively expanded those concepts to include a number of commonly known fairy tales, such as Hansel and Gretel and Jack and the Beanstalk. These fairy tales would all come together to be represented in a single kingdom known as Daventry, and as you played the game, you would encounter multiple classic characters from these fairy tales, interacting with them to solve puzzles and work towards your eventual goal, that being to find and retrieve 3 magical items that had been lost across the kingdom. Eventually, all of the different aspects of the game's design came together, and King's Quest would be readied for release in 1984. Considering the new engine the game was built using, and the unique features and advanced capabilities built into the game, Sierra's team expected King's Quest to take the world by storm. Finally, it was released on the IBM PC Junior as planned, and didn't sell that well at all, mainly because the IBM PC Junior as a computer platform didn't sell all that well either. Because of that lack of sales, Sierra was actually dangerously close to shutting down for good, because they had invested a ton of money into the creation of King's Quest, and if they couldn't offset that investment, they might literally be facing financial ruin. Now, you might ask, couldn't they port the game to other systems? Well, unfortunately at the time, the answer to that was no, as they had designed the AGI engine to work with systems that needed a certain amount of memory, and the IBM PC Junior was the only machine currently on the market capable of meeting those requirements. The AGI engine itself was designed to be portable to different systems. It's just that there weren't other computers that could actually run it. It was effectively too advanced for its own good. While the situation looked bleak, the company would luckily be saved by the release of both the Tandy 1000 and the Apple IIc, both of which had enough memory to run King's Quest without issue. The game was quickly ported to those systems and went on to sell extremely well, to the tune of over 500,000 copies being sold, a ridiculous number for the time, and sales that would eclipse the majority of future adventure games released on the market. As newer and subsequently more powerful computer systems continued to be introduced to the market, King's Quest would continue to be ported, becoming incredibly popular over time and securing Sierra's place as an adventure game behemoth unlike nearly any other company in the industry. From those humble beginnings, the King's Quest series would eventually become an 8-game franchise and would effectively endear Roberta Williams and Sierra to the gaming public. The majority of those titles would remain traditional point-and-click adventures, while the final game in the series, King's Quest VIII, would try and jump on the 3D adventure bandwagon, which unfortunately was not met with as much critical acclaim or commercial sales. Returning our attention to the first entry in the series, it is absolutely a classic adventure game in every sense of the word, and is one that maintains a very special place in computer game history. This was the game that brought graphics and interactivity in adventure gaming to new heights, with a story of whimsy and fairy tale wonder that enchanted tons of people. As we'll talk about in a little bit, everything you've heard about the puzzles is true, and the degree to which you can fail or die are particularly brutal. But I have to give Sierra a small pass on this one. This game was created before designers really knew what they should or shouldn't do when creating an adventure game. Now, you might argue that Roberta Williams had some experience with designing games from her high-res titles, but to that I say, this was still an industry and genre that was in its infancy stages. It doesn't really matter from my perspective that Roberta had designed several games before. People were so happy to be experiencing such technologically advanced content that the vast majority didn't really question the quote-unquote quality of the experience. It's like going to see a special effects feature in a movie theater. You're probably not going for an Academy Award level experience. You're going to see just how far technology and movie magic has come in comparison to where it used to be. King's Quest, while certainly a valiant effort to advance the state of both interactive storytelling as well as graphical prowess, is probably a better technical showcase than it is a shining example of what adventure games could be. That next leap in adventure gaming would be more of an evolution over the years following King's Quest release, and would eventually result in adventure titles, puzzles, and interactivity being shined to a ridiculously bright sheen in the 90s. We'll talk about my own opinion on the original version of King's Quest in just a little bit, but regardless of what I think, King's Quest was well liked by many people during its initial release period, so much so that it was remade and re-released a number of times over the years. Sierra even remade the title themselves as new computers with more advanced capabilities were released over the years, even eventually translating it from its AGI engine beginnings into the more full-featured complex SCI engine in 1990. Later, in 2001, there was a fan remake of the game that added a number of more advanced features, including improved artwork, music, and voice acting, with the actual voice actors from future King's Quest titles reprising their roles in the remake, effectively making a modern remaster similar to the first two Monkey Island games, albeit as a result of a totally unofficial fan-driven effort rather than an official re-release. Later, in 2015, there was even a brand new episodic King's Quest series that was released to a fairly strong reception. Now, I personally haven't played that new series yet, but I've heard from several people that it is actually quite good. I'll certainly be trying it at some point, but I haven't had the opportunity to dive in just yet. Anyway, to say there's a fan community behind the King's Quest series would be an understatement. For many, King's Quest represents the first experience individuals had with a true graphical adventure game, and would pave the way for other Sierra titles like Quest for Glory, Police Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, Space Quest, Gabriel Knight, and countless others. These titles certainly introduce improvements over time, and if you compare King's Quest without historical perspective to other games released later, it pales in comparison. But given the time it was released, and the incredible influence it had on adventure games from that point forward, it is absolutely a classic adventure experience and deserves to be respected and admired even today. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play King's Quest today versus when it was released 40 years ago. Before we begin though, I feel the need to provide some context around my latest playthrough, which is what all of the impressions I'm about to relay are based on. As longtime listeners know, whenever I play a game for our podcast, I always try to play the original version of the title, even if there may have been remakes, remasters, or other future releases that may in fact be more feature-rich than the original version of any given game. Most of the time, that choice involves me playing a game that might have slightly inferior graphics to later versions, or lower quality audio, or in some instances some slight gameplay alterations. With King's Quest though, the situation is a bit different, as I decided to play the very first version of King's Quest ever released, which like we talked about, was for the IBM PC Junior system. There have been a ton of both official and fan remakes of King's Quest, including those that added additional graphics fidelity, point-and-click gameplay, story refinement, and even some versions that removed a number of the quote-unquote unfair deaths that many have suggested plagued early Sierra Adventure titles. Well, I didn't want to touch any of those. I really wanted to experience the original in all of its early computing glory. So that's exactly what I did, and everything I'm about to talk about applies exclusively to the IBM PC Junior version of the title. I have played more refined versions at various points over my gaming career, and I can say with certainty that they all do a great job at modernizing this classic adventure title. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. Today, It's all about the original King's Quest. So let's talk about it. King's Quest, as most are likely aware, is an early adventure title developed by Sierra Online. And note, I said adventure title, not point-and-click adventure title, because there is no pointing and clicking included in this game. The original version of King's Quest predates the use of the computer mouse as a common way of interacting with games, and as such, all of your interaction with the game is accomplished using your trusty keyboard and leveraging whatever imagination you may have lurking in your head. Now, it's important to note that while King's Quest utilizes a text-driven parser, it is not a text adventure game, because unlike many of its peers released around this time, King's Quest features a full suite of graphical capabilities, where the game world is presented to you on the top 2/3 of the screen, while your parser interface resides in the bottom third of the screen. In what was an innovative feature for the time, you actually see your character on the screen as you navigate the world, which is accomplished by using your arrow keys on your keyboard to move around a given screen, walk towards objects, walk away from enemies, and walk through the edge of the screen, resulting in a new screen being loaded. Movement is a bit unique in comparison to future keyboard-driven movement schemes, in that your character will continue to move in the direction that you press until you either press a new direction, press the same direction again, or come into contact with a solid object in the game world, like a wall or a tree. As an example, if you're standing in the middle of an empty field and press the up arrow on your keyboard, your character will continue to walk up towards the top of the screen until you either press up again, which will stop your movement entirely, press a different direction on the keyboard, which will start you walking in that direction, or you collide with an object, which will leave you walking indefinitely into that object, like a sightless Energizer Bunny. I will admit, getting used to this movement scheme took a few minutes, because my assumption was that my character would move if I held down an arrow key, but would stop moving if I took my finger off the key. This was an entirely incorrect assumption, though once I got used to the unique mechanics in the game, it began to feel fairly natural to navigate the game's world. And as you play King's Quest, you're going to have to do a lot of navigating, as the game is composed of a series of screens in an 8x6 grid, with 8 screens representing the horizontal axis in the game, and 6 screens representing the vertical axis in the game. Interestingly, the map itself circles back on itself, similar to what you might see if these screens were transposed onto a very small planet surface. Meaning, if you reach the end of a horizontal row or vertical column, you won't be stopped in your tracks. Rather, if you go past the end of a row or column, you'll simply appear in the screen corresponding to the other end of that row or column, similar to how in Pac-Man you can navigate off one side of the screen and appear on the other, unscathed. This is definitely an interesting design decision, and makes creating a map of the overall game, which I did end up doing, by the way, a little bit trickier than it might otherwise have been, since you have to remember that the map loops back on itself. Anyway, the core 48 screens we were just talking about make up the majority of the overworld for the game's map, though there are additional scenes and screens that are included for various internal environments, like the inside of a witch's house, a mystical land in the sky, and an underground leprechaun cave. Altogether, the game probably has somewhere around 70 or so screens, which is a surprising amount of content for what is effectively the prototype for every adventure game that would be released in later years. And each screen, by the way, contains a variety of different items to examine, objects to pick up, and characters to interact with. Though as you might imagine, given the game's age, the degree of interactivity here is dramatically lower than in future adventure titles. And speaking of interactivity, the way you interact with anything in the game world is by walking up to it and then typing a command into the game's text parser, which then causes some action to happen, assuming you figure out what a given object is called and you identify an appropriate command that the parser will understand. Now, I recognize that text parser inputs in games can be pretty challenging to get right, and I further understand that King's Quest, being a very early adventure title, didn't have the benefit of leveraging other adventure titles' success to refine their own text parser. But, even with that said, I do have to complain a bit about the text parser interface, because it really is a fairly restrictive implementation that limits, rather than supports, your imagination. I'll give you a couple examples of situations I encountered that hampered my ability to play the game, if only for a little bit. I should preface what I'm about to say, though, with the fact that despite these slight irritations, I actually mostly enjoyed the text parser interface for the game, and found that the game's format and general structure was simple enough that I never really got stuck for too long before figuring out the command that the computer was expecting. This certainly wasn't a 100% smooth experience, but considering this was literally one of the earliest graphical adventure games ever created, I'll cut it just a little bit of slack. Anyway, at one point in the game, assuming you take the necessary steps, you'll receive a fiddle. You might think, like I did, that after acquiring the fiddle, you might be able to use it. Only, no, the game doesn't like that at all. Instead of using a fiddle, you're supposed to play a fiddle, a fact that, in retrospect, makes a ton of sense, but in the moment was a tad perplexing. I know that this is one of the kinds of situations that Ron Gilbert discussed when he wrote his treatise on why adventure games suck and what developers can do about it, but experiencing it in practice is a lot different than reading about hypothetical examples in what amounted to an essay on game design. The fact that use and play were two distinct commands in this context, and that the parser didn't recognize use as a suitable synonym for play, was definitely something that even back in 1984 should have likely been addressed. Another situation I encountered involved trying to pick up a round object in the forest, which sounds simple if you could figure out what that object actually was. I tried all sorts of different words for what I thought the object might be. A basin, a cauldron, a bucket, a basket. Nope, none of those worked. It turns out the item was, in fact, a bowl, and the game wouldn't accept anything other than bowl in order for me to interact with that object. A situation like this, admittedly, is partly my fault, because it's entirely possible that someone else looking at the specific graphic on the screen might jump to the conclusion that the object was a bowl. But let's say that you were, like me, totally dumbfounded as to what the item might be. If you didn't have access to a guide, or a hint line, or some way to get help, you might literally be unable to complete the game, simply because you didn't know what a given object was. There was no way, to the best of my knowledge, to simply survey the scene as you might do in full text-based adventure titles, where typically, as you navigate the world, the game gives you a fairly robust description of each area you're exploring, which can help you focus on what interactable items might be present in a given location. Because King's Quest was focused on delivering graphics for that world-based exploration and not text, there was something lost here, because the graphics, while awesome for the time, just didn't have a high enough level of fidelity to make it obvious as to what each object in the game world was. You couldn't simply type "look around" or "examine surroundings" or anything like that. You had to figure out what item was in front of you and use the exact right phrasing in order for the parser to understand what you were trying to do. While somewhat irritating, this was pretty much par for the course with any text parser-driven title back in the 80s, and honestly, is pretty much par for the course with all text parser-driven titles, even the niche releases that exist today. While developers have gotten a lot better at providing for different options and anticipating potential player interpretations, there's always the chance that someone comes up with something that a game designer simply didn't expect, which can break the illusory wall of immersion that can sometimes occur when you're playing a really engrossing game. I can forgive King's Quest for these issues, because like I said, it is a prototypical title, and one that was trying to do things literally no game had done before, and to a degree that could apply to some of the game's puzzles too. But here, I have to take a little bit more exception to the game's design, because, man, are some of these puzzles ridiculous. And to note, I will be partially spoiling some puzzles included in the game, so consider yourself forewarned if you haven't played the original version of King's Quest yet. I know I don't usually do spoilers, but in order to really talk about these puzzles, I've got to spoil a little bit, so I apologize about that. Anyway, the obvious example of a puzzle that literally required a peek into Roberta Williams' own brain is the classic Rumpelstiltskin puzzle. And actually, before we talk about that, I should probably mention that nearly every character, and interaction, and environment, and quest, and puzzle in the game is derived, at least in part, from very well-known fairy tales and fables, which makes the game world and its denizens feel instantly familiar, despite being placed in an unfamiliar game. Anyway, the Rumpelstiltskin puzzle. This one has achieved a level of fame and notoriety for using a very non-traditional interpretation of a clue that is, in fact, included in the game. If you explore Witch's House, located in one section of the game world, you'll discover a note, which helpfully tells you that sometimes it makes sense to think about things backwards. If you're like me, the first time I played the game, you likely filed this tidbit of knowledge away somewhere in the back of your brain, with the assumption that at some point you'd have to come back to it, but you weren't sure where or how it could be used. Well, eventually, you come across the famous Rumpelstiltskin character, and he poses a riddle to you, indicating that if you can tell him his name in 3 tries or less, that he'll give you a magical item to assist you in your journey. Well, your first thought is likely to type in the name Rumpelstiltskin, which it turns out is not the right answer. Then you might remember that you picked up a note instructing you to think about things backwards, and you might deduce that the note is suggesting that you should reverse Rumpelstiltskin's name. So you put the name, and I'm going to try to pronounce this one, Nixtelslempmer into the parser, which is Rumpelstiltskin in reverse, trust me. Only, nope, that doesn't work either. So at this point, you likely did what I did, which is consult a strategy guide, at which point you realize that the whole backwards thing was meant to symbolize the fact that you had to use a reverse alphabet to match the position of each letter of Rumpelstiltskin to reversed alphabet letter positions, which results in the name, Ifnikovgrabrum. You put that name in, which obviously is fairly common in Daventry, and the gnome is satisfied, dropping a magical item for you before leaving to do something somewhere else. Even knowing the solution to this puzzle, and recognizing the logic needed to solve the puzzle, I still really don't like it. Ms. Williams, please, what the heck were you thinking? There does come a point where you may in fact be too clever for your own good. And this is one of those situations. Outside of that puzzle, which is pretty much the definition of moon logic in adventure games, the rest of the puzzles in the game are surprisingly decent, though I do have to call attention to the open-ended nature of the game and its puzzles, which from my perspective is both a blessing and a curse. One thing that really impressed me about this iteration of King's Quest is the fact that puzzles can be solved in a number of different ways, each of which is a totally valid solution, even if it might not be the optimal way of solving a certain puzzle. The thing is though, this open-endedness can sometimes cause confusion as to whether you actually are accomplishing anything, and can also make it so that certain more optimal puzzle solutions are no longer available, making specific paths through the game effectively impossible to solve. Take, for example, the acquisition of a carrot, which you can find in a garden not too far from your castle starting point. And yes, I said garden deliberately, because from a parser perspective, that is the only word that the thing recognizes on that particular screen. You can't say farm, even though the graphics really look like a farm, and you can't say crops because I suppose crops are grown on a farm, not in a garden. The only way to even realize that a carrot is available to pick up is if you recognize the screen you're on represents a garden, at which point the game will tell you that you're in front of a carrot patch. Okay, cool. Let's say you figure that out, and you end up picking up a carrot. Well, you might think that bringing a carrot to a couple of woodcutters who complain of not having any food might be the thing to do, and if you do that, they will very graciously accept your gift. Only that action doesn't solve the woodcutter's puzzle, and it further results in you losing your carrot and shutting off an entire potential puzzle solution that the carrot could have been used for, which in this case involves a goat and a troll. So let's say you don't give the carrot to the woodcutters, and instead bring it to a nearby goat pen with the hopes of using it to lure a goat outside to a different screen in the game. You may go into the goat pen and hand the carrot to the goat, and the goat, being a goat, will gladly eat the carrot. Only then, you've yet again lost your carrot and blocked off a potential puzzle solution. Instead, the real way you're supposed to use the carrot is by showing it to the goat, and then walking with the goat to a nearby bridge upon which a troll is waiting. The goat, when presented with this situation, decides to ram the troll off the bridge, clearing the way for you to progress to the next screen. Now, hearing that sequence of events, you might think, okay, that makes sense, but I probably wouldn't have thought of that exact sequence of events to solve that puzzle. And the cool thing is, you don't have to, as there are numerous solutions to that puzzle chain that, while not optimal, still allow you to progress in the game. Let's say you lost your carrot either to the woodcutters or the goat. Well, as long as you have a valuable treasure like a bag of diamonds, you can pay the troll's toll and he'll end up leaving the area, content the toll was paid. You might not get as many points in the long run, but you can still at least continue in the game. And honestly, I loved how open-ended the game was in terms of allowing for multiple solutions to different puzzles you might encounter. This is a feature that very few adventure games support, even today, with many titles requiring a specific course of action in order to complete certain puzzles. The fact that King's Quest in 1984 allowed for such a wide variety of player choice, with the only impact being the number of points you'd receive, is an interesting and commendable design decision. And speaking of points, the original King's Quest predates the use of the Sierra standard of displaying a running point total at the top of the screen, letting you know when you did something good and when you did something bad. There is an inventory screen included in the title, accessible by pressing your tab key, and on that screen the game will display your current point total. And in the game's instruction manual, you'll be told that there are a total of 158 points available in the game. So technically, you'll know how optimally you played the game by comparing your in-game point total to the 158 maximum value that the manual informs you about. But, as anyone who has ever played a more modern Sierra Online title likely knows, not having a running total on the screen just felt a little weird, as that point total is so synonymous with Sierra Adventures that it's almost hard to imagine a title without that running total appearing somewhere on the screen. I had to get over this psychological issue myself as I played King's Quest, and while I did eventually overcome the issue, I absolutely still wished the points were included somewhere on the main display screen. I know this sounds like a small issue, and honestly, it is. But as a Sierra Adventure aficionado, this is something I noticed pretty much immediately after firing up King's Quest. Moving on, we should probably talk a little bit about the deaths in the game, because as many people likely know, there are a ton of ways to die in King's Quest, not all of which would be considered an avoidable death short of trial and error. The most obvious example here from my perspective, and one I've referenced on prior episodes of the podcast, is the infamous rolling rock, where if you approach a certain rock from the wrong side and attempt to push it, it will instead roll downhill and crush you, killing you in the process. This is probably the most heinous death in the game, though there are a ton of other situations that will undoubtedly kill you, including falling into an alligator-filled moat, attempting to swim in a series of quick-moving river rapids, falling off a precipitously high beanstalk, falling through a fluffy cloud, running into an ogre, or a witch, or a wolf, and accidentally stepping off the side of a set of stairs, just to name a few. Finding all of the ways you can die in this game is almost a separate challenge itself, and despite the significant number of deadly situations, I never felt all that frustrated. And the reason I didn't feel frustrated is, I knew what I was getting myself into when I began playing the game, so I made regular use of the game's save system, saving my game whenever I made any sort of meaningful progress, in the hopes of not having to redo too much work should I end up encountering a deadly situation. The save and reload system works really well here, and because I was extra cautious to begin with, my overall progression through the game ended up being a mostly smooth kind of experience, despite dying numerous times. The only other item I should mention is the fact that there are a couple less standard control mechanics that can be situationally useful. For one, you have the ability to jump, which from what I can tell is useful in literally one screen in the entire game. You also have the ability to crouch, which from what I saw is useful in literally no situation you'll encounter, unless there's some weird out-of-the-way scenario that requires you to crouch that I simply didn't find. And finally, you have the ability to swim, which needs to be activated whenever you enter a body of non-deadly water, otherwise you will drown, which is of course yet another way of dying in the game. Out of those three untraditional movement mechanics, swimming is by far the most useful throughout the game, as there are a ton of different bodies of water, and sometimes swimming through them is quicker than walking around them. Anyway, hopefully it's apparent that King's Quest is both a unique adventure experience as well as a very early adventure experience, which depending on your frame of mind, may or may not appeal to you. I'll give you some more insights into my own opinions on this title in just a few minutes, but first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look like. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have a ton of gameplay videos we could look up. The only thing we had might have been magazine reviews or word of mouth, but most of the time, it was a decision that was made in the gaming store. We might pass a box that looked cool. If so, we picked it up, flipped it over. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might buy it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. And especially when we talk about King's Quest, this is from a period of time that even gaming publications didn't really exist in all that great capacity yet. So this is truly one of those experiences where seeing a box on the shelf could really sell you on the title. So for King's Quest for the IBM PC Junior computer platform, the back of the box says absolutely nothing, because IBM around this time was really a business kind of company, and they didn't really understand, from my perspective, how to package and sell games, even for their IBM PC Junior platform. So because of that, the original release, and we're talking the very original release of King's Quest, came in a plastic case with no appreciable text on the back of the box. The front of the box, however, actually does look pretty darn intriguing. It shows a castle in the background with green fields and some other kinds of landmarks. There's like a river and some hills further back, and in the front of the graphic is a knight with red eyes, a shield, full suit of armor, and a sword, which I don't think ever appeared in the game itself. Call it potentially some false advertising, but regardless, that was the box as it existed, and there is a little blurb on the front of the box which says, "Take on the challenge. Find the magic treasure, put on your armor and your thinking cap as you search the countryside in the days when knights were bold and brave." And then, of course, there is a logo here that says IBM Personal Computer Software, and a little red kind of section with some text that says Entertainment Family, which I guess is the way to show that this is actually a game and not a piece of productivity software. And I have got to say, today, if I'm looking at this from a modern perspective, the box does not sell me at all. But if I'm looking at it from the perspective of somebody back then who's walking around and sees a really cool, and it is cool looking image of a knight on a screen in front of a castle, and who knows what lurks in that mystical world, yeah, I think I would have bought it. I think I would have gotten it. Now, when this first came out, I was literally 3 years old, and trying to put me in front of King's Quest to play it to completion probably would have been an act of futility. But I can look at it in retrospect and say, it's kind of intriguing, taking a look at the front of the box and the image on the box. It doesn't do nearly as good of a job of selling itself as future titles and future boxes would do, but for an early adventure game, there is something intriguing here, and I've got to give it credit. I probably would have stopped in the store and kind of did a double take seeing the image on the box. Anyway, we're going to move on and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics for King's Quest are incredibly primitive when compared to modern titles, mainly because this game was released before graphics were a standard in computer titles. That said, for the most part, the graphics look pretty darn good and are certainly evocative despite the fact that they are lower fidelity than what most gamers are used to. My only complaint related to the graphics has to do with some of the objects that you can pick up to add to your inventory, which can occasionally be unrecognizable, like the bowl example we discussed previously, or so subtle that you might not even recognize there's an item to pick up, like what you might see with a series of pebbles on the bank of a river. If the graphics were just a smidge higher quality, it would have been incredibly useful, but even as it stands, the visuals look nicely quaint and certainly evoke the feeling of experiencing an old-school adventure title, which personally, I enjoyed. Animations, meanwhile, are surprisingly good, and I especially enjoyed some of the non-standard animations that you might stumble on, like bowing to the king, diving underwater, and falling down a hole. There's a lot of emotion included in these very low-fidelity pixel art animations, and I thought the art team did a great job in conveying that emotion with very restrictive limitations in place. Overall, I found the graphics to be mostly enjoyable, and despite their age, I really do think the game looks pretty darn good. Moving on to the sound and music, there really is no music in the game at all, short of a very short opening segment and a couple of musical interludes that play for a few seconds at different points in the game. Otherwise, most of the sound in the game is effectively a series of computer speaker-based sound effects, which all work fine within the context of the game, but are otherwise totally forgettable. This is an area where the age of the title does in fact work against it, as the minimal sounds included in the game is probably the biggest indicator that this is a very old and not quite as immersive title as those that would follow in its footsteps. The lack of sounds didn't really impact my enjoyment of the title much, if at all, but if you're expecting a high-quality auditory environment, that's not really what you're going to get with King's Quest. Oh, and by the way, the music you've been hearing throughout this episode are all from various remakes and remasters of the original title. A decision I made so that I could make sure that this episode would have at least some modicum of sound included with it. Otherwise, all we'd hear is a couple beeps and boops, which, despite being a function of the time in which the game was created, isn't all that interesting to listen to from a modern perspective. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Sir Graham, a brave knight in the Kingdom of Daventry, a land ruled over by benevolent monarch King Edward. Unfortunately, the Kingdom of Daventry has fallen on some hard times, and in order to restore the kingdom to its former glory, King Edward believes that 3 magical artifacts need to be found: a mirror, a shield, and a bottomless treasure chest. King Edward sends for Sir Graham and gives him a mission. He's to be the person who will seek out and retrieve those 3 missing treasures. If he's successful, the Kingdom of Daventry may be saved, and prosperity can be returned to the kingdom. If he's not, though, there's a very real possibility that Daventry will simply fade into oblivion, never to be seen or heard again. This story, while super simple in its original incarnation, actually worked for me, and gave a good dose of inspiration as for why you're ultimately going on your quest. The story is fairly thin here, in that there's simply not much to it, but honestly, given the context of this particular adventure title, that's totally fine. Normally, I'd levy a critique against an adventure title with such a threadbare story, but given King's Quest's age and how it evolved over time, I'm surprisingly okay with it. It'll never win any deep narrative awards, but what is here is done well, and that's good enough for me in this instance. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a good bit about the controls and general playability of the title, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I will reiterate, though, is that King's Quest is one of those games that really does benefit from taking your time, jotting down notes, and making a map to help keep track of all of the different locations and people you may need to interact with. I had a surprising amount of fun letting myself go totally old school while playing, creating a real, on-paper map and writing notes to myself whenever appropriate. Is this 100% necessary for beating King's Quest? No, not really, and the degree of choice and alternate paths for solving certain puzzles means that, surprisingly, there aren't really that many dead-end paths, as long as you don't do anything completely off-the-wall crazy. I admit that I didn't really test the boundaries here, meaning I didn't do anything to intentionally try to break the game, so it's very possible that more dead ends exist than what I personally encountered. Still, I believe if you play the game normally, so to speak, you shouldn't have too much difficulty in saving yourself from situations where you legitimately cannot progress, short of restarting the game. Deaths, on the other hand, I'd save early and save often, because there are a ton of ways to die in the game. Though I will admit that there weren't nearly as many deaths that resulted from complete trial and error or unexpected situations as I expected. Other than the rock rolling down the hill death I mentioned earlier, every single one of my deaths were tied to walking somewhere I probably shouldn't have, or messing up with the movement controls and inadvertently falling down a flight of stairs, into a river, off of a cloud, or something similar. You should be aware that there is a certain nuance to the controls, and you probably will make some mistakes along the way, which is one of the reasons why you really should save fairly frequently, otherwise you could lose some progress. Luckily though, the game isn't terribly long, other than time spent figuring out the puzzles and what to do, so even if you do have to restart your adventure, it shouldn't be too hard to get back to your former progress. From my perspective, the best way to play this iteration of King's Quest is to truly let yourself get lost in the experience. Put your phones away, avoid using a guide if possible, and simply experience what it was like to be a gamer in the early 80s. Get a pen, grab some paper, and sleuth your way through the experience. I really believe that if you decide to play the game like that, you should find a lot to like with King's Quest's overall gameplay and mechanics, even though it lacks nearly everything that I would consider to be a modern amenity. And the fact is, despite its age, King's Quest is a surprisingly decent adventure game that I believe almost any gamer would have a good time playing. Later titles would undeniably refine a lot of what King's Quest tried to do, and would modernize a lot of what made King's Quest unique. That said, even though the game as designed represents the equivalent of an adventure game prototype, it's still a pretty darn enjoyable prototype waiting to be experienced by gamers young and old, and after getting used to the unique eccentricities the game offers, I believe there's a good amount of fun to be had here, and I know I personally enjoyed my time playing the game, even though it was sometimes difficult to get the game to actually understand what I wanted it to do. So what is our verdict on King's Quest? Well, King's Quest is undeniably a function of its time, while at the same time being so innovative and future-leaning that it ultimately transcends its time to become one of the most important video and computer game releases of all time. Without King's Quest, it's unclear if the adventure game genre would ever have reached the heights that it did in the later 80s and 90s, and it's very possible that Sierra as a company wouldn't have grown into the computer industry behemoth that it would end up becoming. While there is a ton to like here and appreciate, being an important game doesn't automatically make a title a good game, and the fact is that King's Quest does have some flaws when looked at from a modern perspective. Especially in its original release, the game caters to a style of gameplay that is a bit more old school than what most modern gamers are willing to devote themselves to. There's a surprising amount of goodness here, and there's a ton of innovation at play, but the game itself is not an entirely smooth experience. Which is why, for me, King's Quest has just become the newest member of our list of golden oldies. It is a truly vintage, old-school experience that rewards dedicated gameplay, careful observation, and occasional off-the-wall logical leaps, and I believe that almost everyone should play the game at some point in their gaming careers, if only to witness what was effectively the early popularization of an entire video game genre and company. It might not be as easy to play as future titles, remakes, and remasters would become, but that in no way diminishes what King's Quest does accomplish, which is the creation of a thought-provoking and challenging early adventure game experience. And that is why the very first King's Quest ever created, despite its age and lack of modern sensibilities, has just become the newest addition to our collection of golden oldies. That was our episode on King's Quest. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Rise of the Robots, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure that I am hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to build our community and continue to create the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Rise of the Robots. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.